All right, hey, did you bring a Bible? The correct answer is yes, I brought my Bible.
Yes,
You came
I
to
brought my
church,
Bible.
bring your Bible. I don't care if you bring a tablet or a phone with a Bible app, but get your Bible out so you can see what God is saying to you. Please don't think like, hey, I went to church, I heard somebody talk about the Bible, I've interacted with God, God's Word was written to us and for us, and let's take some time and look at it. So we are in 1 Samuel. We've been in this study for a few weeks, and if you remember last week, we said that right choices for the wrong reasons are wrong choices. So we were talking about the story where Israel asked God for a king. Now, it wasn't wrong to ask for a king, but the reasons they were asking for a king made it wrong. They were asking out of fear. They were asking because they wanted to be like the nations around them. They were asking because they didn't want Samuel's sons to judge them. They weren't asking God, now is it time for a king? They were insisting it was time for a king. So Samuel warned them. He said, hey, guys, you don't want to do this. If you get a king, the king's going to take your sons, and he's going to make them work in the army. He's going to take your daughters. He's going to make them servants. He's going to take your fields and your vineyards and your donkeys and the best of your land. And do you really want a king? And they're like, yeah, we want a king. And in 1 Samuel chapter 8, verse 18, Samuel said, in that day you will cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves, but the Lord will not answer you. Are you sure you want to choose this? Are you sure that even though God is saying this is bad for you, that you want this? And they said yes, they want it. So hear this if you hear nothing else. When you reject the king, you reject his blessings and his protection. That's what Samuel was saying. If you're going to reject God as king, and you're going to choose from amongst yourselves one who will stand, even if you ask God to choose, if you're going to submit to this man, you're going to be in favor of his protection and his blessings, and you're forfeiting the blessings and protection of God. Now, for the slow kids who kind of learn on my level, that means when we choose to ignore the king's words, we ignore the king. When we reject the king's commands, we're rejecting the king. God doesn't have a system with like A followers and B followers and C followers. Jesus repeatedly said, you're either for me or against me. I'm either your Lord or I'm not. Now, that sounds really harsh, but I didn't write the rules. And that's the way God looks at it. Either you're living in submission or you're not. The king has never offered a royal suggestion. He gives royal commands. But he won't force compliance. They asked for a king. God said, you want a king? Here you go. We're going to read the story this morning of God giving them a king. Anybody recognize this guy? All right, let's get a vote. Thumbs up or thumbs down? What do you think?
Thumbs down.
Hey, we know the end of the story. Do you know the beginning of the story? In 1938, he was Time's Man of the Year. I mean, that's a pretty good honor. See, at the end of World War I, Germany surrendered, and most of the German citizens weren't very happy about that. They felt that the war was mismanaged, that their king had mismanaged the war, and that they felt they could have won that war. So they were not happy with the current system of government. And this Austrian kid named Adolf Hitler, who volunteered for the German army, who was a pretty good public speaker, joined what was then this unknown Nazi party, and he kind of rose through the ranks, and in 1923, they tried to overtake the government of Germany with a violent coup. People died, and Adolf Hitler was thrown in jail where he wrote the book Mein Kampf, My Suffering, My Journey. He gets out of jail, and he goes back to this Nazi party and starts to rise in power even more, and he tells them, hey, the way to get what we want is not through violence, but it's through this strategy of legality, and he starts to politic to make himself a little more well-known. He gets himself appointed as chancellor, which is, in our world, kind of like vice president. But in 1933, the office of president and chancellor is combined, and he finds himself as the president or chancellor, it's the same title at that point. He is now the leader of Germany. As the leader of Germany over the next 5 years, he effectively ends unemployment. Unemployment was unheard of in the late 30s in Germany. He rebuilt the military until Germany was a force to be reckoned with. And in 1938, he was Time Magazine's Man of the Year. He sounds like a great guy, right? But to anyone who knows the end of the story, or even remotely knows the end of the story, we know Hitler's a bad dude. And what we're going to see in the next 2 chapters of Samuel is the rise of King Saul. Now, any Jew who was reading this historical book, and that's what Samuel is, it's a historical book, when they got to the chapter on Saul, they weren't going, oh man, this guy seems great, I wonder how this is going to pan out. They know it goes south. We know as we read this, even though it looks like it's going to start out good, things are going to go south quickly. None of you in this room, when listening to Hitler's resume, was going, oh, how did it work out? Was the guy... Right? We all know it's going to end poorly. And if you don't know, let me warn you, it's going to end poorly with Saul. Things aren't going to go well, but they're asking God for a king. So in 1 Samuel chapter 9, verse 1, there was a man of Benjamin whose name was Kish, the son of Abiel, son of Zeror, son of Bechorath, son of Apia. Those names don't matter. I can barely pronounce them. He was a Benjamite, so he's a Jew. He's a man of wealth, so he's rich. And he had a son whose name was Saul. He was a handsome young man. There was not a man among the people of Israel more handsome than he. From his shoulders upward, he was taller than any of the people. So think like Saul Kardashian, right? Think Gaston from Beauty and the Beast. Like this guy's just like a mountain of a man. He's tall, he's beautiful, he comes from a wealthy family, looks like a king. Great, perfect. Let's go with that guy. I mean, he's going to strike fear in the heart of any man who comes against him. He looks like a natural-born leader. So the story begins as we're introduced to Saul, and he's lost his father's donkeys. The donkeys are lost, and he's gone to look for them. Now, you're going to see these tiny little red flags through the story, okay? If Saul is supposed to be the king of Israel, it'd be nice if the king had some, shepherding skills. But immediately, the first thing we learn about him is he's lost his father's donkeys, and he goes searching for them for days. His father says, go find the donkeys. Now, to be fair, let's build Saul's resume here. He's certainly committed to do what his father told him to do. And so far in the book of Samuel, we haven't seen that. Right? Hophni and Phinehas were nightmares of children to Eli the priest. Abijah and Joel were terrible sons to Samuel. So the story of a son who does what his father asks him to do, hey man, that's a nice turn of events. So he goes looking for days, and after a couple of days he says to his servant, hey man, we might just want to call it quits on finding these donkeys, because at this point, my father is going to be more worried about us than he is worried about the donkeys. So he's concerned. He's compassionate. He's thinking about his father. He's thinking about, yeah, my dad wants to find these donkeys and I want to find them, but at some point Dad's going to worry more about me than he does the animals. And his buddy who's with him, his servant, says, well, hey man, we're not that far from the town where Samuel lives. Samuel's a prophet. Why don't we go, we just kind of ask Samuel if maybe the Lord would tell him where the donkeys are. And Saul says, okay, let's do that. So Saul takes counsel really well. He takes counsel from someone who's essentially beneath him, a servant, and he's going to get counsel from someone he respects who's essentially over him. So far, this sounds like a pretty good guy. So he goes and he finds Samuel, and beginning at chapter 10, Samuel tells him, hey man, the donkeys have been found. They're back home with your dad now. Chapter 10, verse 1, Samuel takes a flask of oil, pours it on Saul's head, and kisses him and says, has not the Lord anointed you to be prince over his people of Israel? And you shall reign over the people of the Lord, and you will save them from the hand of their surrounding enemies. Oh, snap. I came looking for donkeys. And he finds the prophet, and the prophet anoints him. Hey man, you heard all this talk about people wanting a king? You're the guy. You're the guy I'm going to appoint as the first king of Israel. And in chapter 10, verse 9, It says, when Saul turned his back to leave Samuel, God gave him another heart. That God actually came upon Samuel, and it says all these signs came to pass, and what Samuel said was, hey, as you leave and start home, you're going to run into 3 men, and they're going to have 3 loaves of bread, and they're going to offer you 2, and you're going to run to these 2 guys who are looking for something. And he gives them all these markers to show, like, hey, when this happens, and this happens, and this happens, and this happens, this is to confirm what happened here today. You are going to be the king. And all these signs come to pass, and God gives Saul a new heart. So think like Ezekiel 36:26, written hundreds of years later. God says, I will give you a new heart and a new spirit. I will remove your heart of stone. I will give you a heart of flesh. God comes upon Saul and gives Saul every opportunity. Just because we know that Saul's going to blow it, it doesn't mean Saul was God's pawn. God doesn't use people. God gave Saul every opportunity to be the king that Israel needed, even though he knew Saul couldn't do it. Because God is gracious, because God is fair. Samuel says, go home and wait. I'll be there in 7 days. I'm going to come and offer sacrifice, and then I'm going to make the announcement about who the next king is. So Saul goes home. In chapter 10, verse 16, Saul's uncle says, hey, where have you been? And Saul said, we went to see the prophet Samuel, and he told us plainly the donkeys had been found. But about the matter of the kingdom of which Samuel had spoken, he did not tell him anything. So he complies well with instructions. Now, if you were anointed the next president of the United States, and you got home, would you tell somebody?
Yes.
I'm not sure how arrogant I am, but I'm pretty sure I'd tell the people in my house. But Saul is told, keep it under wraps. And he complies. He does exactly what Samuel asked him to do. He doesn't say anything. So Samuel gathers all the elders together, all the elders of the tribes of Israel. In chapter 10, verse 17, Samuel called the people together to the Lord at Mizpah. And he said to the people of the Lord, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, I brought up Israel out of Egypt, and I delivered you from the hand of the Egyptians and from the land of the kingdoms that were oppressing you. But today you have rejected your God, who saves you from all your calamities and your distresses. And you've said to him, set a king over us. Now therefore present yourselves before the Lord by your tribes and by your thousands. Samuel is such a downer. Here we go with you've rejected the king. Here we go. And every time we want to do something good for our country, here comes Samuel telling us we've rejected God. And the people kind of felt like he has to say that stuff, right? Like there's certain things pastors have to say, can't laugh at, they're supposed to talk about. And he just kind of has to say we rejected God. But there's zero concern on behalf of the people for what Samuel said. They're like, okay, get through the part where you tell us we're not supposed to have a king, so we can get to the part where you tell us who the king is. They're completely rejecting the fact that God is speaking right now, saying, this is a bad idea, you don't want to do this. God puts up roadblocks. God puts up yield signs. God puts up stop signs. God will do anything he can do to get you to comply, but he will not force you. Go down to verse 20. Samuel brought all the tribes of Israel near, and the tribe of Benjamin was taken by lot. He brought the tribe of Benjamin near by its clans, and the clans of Matrites was taken by lot. And Saul, the son of Kish, was taken by lot, but when they sought him, he could not be found. So they inquired again of the Lord, is there a man still to come? And the Lord said, behold, he's hidden himself among the baggage. This is his coronation. And he's kind of hiding out. I mean, if you ask me, that sounds kind of humble, right? I mean, he's not really making a big deal of himself. I mean, I'd like to think I'd be kind of standing by the front, like the whole time, like, just, come on, just get it, come on. Like we do. But Saul seems kind of humble, like he's kind of in the back. He's waiting to be called. I mean, if I'm making a list of who I want to be king, those are some pretty good qualities. And yes, I couldn't find a C word for humble. It just, thesaurus failed me, so I had to jump to an H word. So he appoints Saul as king, and the people say, "Long live the king." Finally we got what we want. Now things are going to run smoothly. I'm not going to follow the old religious ways like Samuel. I know you always want to do things the old way, but this is the way the world works now. And sometimes the Bible just seems so outdated and it doesn't fit in 2021. Not in America. That's just not how we do things anymore. And I know better, and even though God says no, I'm going to choose to do things my way. The last verse in chapter 10 says, "But some worthless fellows said, 'How can this man save us?' And they despised him and brought no present." Not my king. That not my president stuff started a long time ago. Not my king. I'm not following Saul. So chapter 11, this is kind of what we've been driving at for a couple of weeks. In chapter 11, King Nahash, the king of the Ammonites, another tribe that's trying to take over Israel's land, moves in on the town of Jabesh Gilead. Now, I had a whole history story about Jabesh Gilead, but it gets super confusing and it's really inappropriate. It's hard to say the Bible's inappropriate. Go read Judges 16 through 19 and tell me if you'd be comfortable talking about it with the age group we have in this room. But Jabesh Gilead is in the town of Benjamin. Saul is from Gibeah, which is also in the area of Benjamin. And these two towns are essentially intermarried. Okay? So an attack against Jabesh Gilead is really, it's not Saul's hometown, but that's where all his relatives are from. So it's an attack on Saul. Now, the Ammonites don't know this, but this has been the driving force behind Israel asking for a king for months, because Nahash was mounting an army, and what they don't want is this continued cycle of nations come and oppress us, and we cry out to God for a judge, and God sends a judge to mount an army, the army kicks them out, yet that was God's plan the whole time. And they think if we have a king, our king will mount an army against the Ammonites. So Saul finds out that Nahash has moved against the town of Jabesh Gilead, and Saul just loses his mind. Not in a bad way. I mean, he rallies the troops and says, every tribe send their warriors, and any tribe that doesn't send warriors is going to answer to me. And then Saul mounts this giant army of 300,000 men. I mean, this guy's a motivator. This is the guy you want. This is the guy you want giving the call to action. Every tribe sends its best warriors because we're going to push Nahash and these Ammonites out of the Israelite kingdom. They're not sticking around here. Chapter 11, verse 11. And the next day Saul put the people into 3 companies, and they came into the midst of the camp in the morning watch and struck down the Ammonites until the heat of the day. And those who survived were scattered so that none of them were left together. I mean, this guy is a commander. I mean, God, I know you said not to get a king, but seriously, this is awesome. I know, God, you said it was bad, but this is great. This could not be going better. We just won a war. In verse 12, then the people said to Samuel, "Who is it that said, 'Shall Saul reign over us?' Bring them then that we may put them to death." Who are these not my king people? Let's get them out here right now. And Saul says, "Not a man shall be put to death this day, for today the Lord has worked salvation in Israel." He's merciful. I mean, come on. I'm not even trying to come up with another. What else would you want out of a king? This guy seems great. Why, Samuel, were you telling us? Hey, Samuel, good call on the no king thing, bonehead. This worked out phenomenally. We didn't do what you wanted to do, and things were great. And isn't that exactly how sin works? I'm going to do what I want to do. And you're like, man, this ain't so bad. In fact, it's exactly what I wanted. But those of us who know the story of Hitler, know the story of Saul, and just because you kind of get some immediate benefits and you think, man, God was wrong. Has God ever been wrong? Has God ever apologized and said, sorry, I blew it? Hey, I didn't mean that. But they're pretty excited. You could not convince an Israelite living in this time at the end of chapter 11 that Saul was a bad idea. Even the guys who said, I'm not serving that joker, just had their lives spared by a guy who led Israel in one of the greatest military campaigns since Gideon. And there's a lot of similarities between Saul's battle and Gideon's battle from back in Judges. This is Hitler, 1938. Saul's the man of the year. He's the guy you want running your country. He's getting it done. I think sometimes maybe God says don't do some things, but it's not really that bad. God warns us about things like idolatry, putting things in front of Him, making things more important than our relationship with God. But hey, sometimes stuff comes up, and is it really all that bad? God hasn't struck me down. My house hasn't been hit by lightning. The Bible talks a lot about purity, watching what you put in front of your eyes, and not lusting after other people, but my eyes didn't burn out. It wasn't all that bad. God says not to covet, but for crying out loud, by me looking at what you have accomplished, doesn't that motivate me to work harder and produce more, and then I can have a better life for my kids? And so, God, I know you said not to covet, but I've kind of turned coveting into something good. The Bible has a lot to say about finances, giving, saving, investing, but it takes a long time before we're willing to even let somebody we trust speak into our lives about finances. And, you can't afford to give money back to God. That's ridiculous. And I still have my house, and I still have my job, and I still eat. So maybe God doesn't really know what He's talking about. And God talks a lot about keeping a pure heart and not becoming critical and bitter. And it's been said that the battle of the young man is lust, and the battle of the old man is critical thinking. And just kind of always being negative. And I didn't believe that. And now I'm actually starting to, because I'm getting negative and old and cranky. The Bible talks about not being selfish. But you got to look out for number one. You got to take care, I have to take care of my family first. I have to take care of me first. And when I focus on me first, I have good things and I have nice things. And yeah, I shouldn't be selfish, but I got to take care of myself, right? How much does the Bible say about pride? But I have to take some pride in my work. I have to take some pride in who I am. God talks about not seeking the pleasures of this world. Well, then maybe He shouldn't have made Himself pleasurable, because I've sought the pleasures of this world and they were pleasurable. Those are things God warns us about, but God commands us to study His Word. And yet we come to church on Sunday and we don't even bring a Bible. But one day a week when someone's actually going to read it to you, we don't do it then. God talks about forgiveness, but God has not met her, right? Whoever she is, you know her. I'm not forgiving her. I'm not doing that. Not him, not now, not ever. God, you don't understand. I can't do it. God commands us to go and make disciples. But my relationship with God is really between me and God. If your thought on your relationship with God is that it's just between you and God, let me help you out. It's just you. God's not involved. And I know that sounds harsh. God says lots of things to men. Lead your families. Lead them well. Raise up children. Lead your home. Pray with your wife. Pray with your kids. It feels awkward. It does. Let me tell you from a guy who's a full-time pastor, it feels weird praying out loud with my wife. So I don't have to do it. I could choose not to. But I don't want to end up like Saul. Women, God has lots of things for women to do. Submit to your husbands. Did He just say that? He did. Read it in multiple places in the Bible. Well, I'm a 21st century woman. I'm not going to let any man tell me what to do, and I wear the pants in the family. How's that going for you? Sounds like you're happy. I've never had a happy woman tell me that. I wear the pants in this family. No man's going to tell me what to do. And you seem so joyful about it. Like you just... Children, respect your parents. What if they're not worthy of respect? What if your dad's a no-good, lazy drunk who doesn't take care of you and your mom and your brother and sisters? Do you still have to respect him? I should have. I should have, and I didn't. And I was wrong. I didn't believe I was wrong. I thought I was right. As it turns out, I was a self-righteous jerk. He should have knocked my teeth out. But I guess he wasn't as bad as I thought he was because he didn't do that. The Bible tells us to respect those in authority over us, whether it's King Saul, whether it's a Roman emperor, whether it's the President of the United States, whether or not you voted for him, whether it's the governor of your state who may or may not make decisions you're happy with, or the policeman who pulls you over, or your boss at work. We're told to be respectful of those who are in authority over us. When you reject the commands of the king, you reject the king. That's how it works. When you reject the commands of the king, you reject the king. You can't say, I'm serving the king and I'm serving God, but I'm not doing the things he's telling me. Well, I'm hitting 9 out of 10. I'm hitting 7 out of 10. I'm hitting 2 out of 10. That's 0. You either serve the king or you don't serve the king. And when you reject the king's commands, you're rejecting the king. Listen, we're God's people, right? I mean, Israel is God's people. They rejected God as king. We're God's people. When we reject God as king, when we decide to disregard what he's telling us and set aside his ways and say, we know better, by rejecting the king's commands, we are rejecting the king. Now, come on, Bob, seriously? I mean, you have to say that because you're the pastor and we're in church and you have to make it sound so big and bad, because if you make it sound like a 10, maybe we'll follow on level 1. I'm not at all doing that. I wouldn't lie to you. I wouldn't placate you. I wouldn't try to overly motivate you on the front end to get you to move a couple steps in the back. I'm simply telling you how God works. God says you're either with me or you're against me. There's like no gray here. And yet we have these areas that we just kind of keep off limits. We have secrets. And, well, they're not killing us and nobody knows. It's not hurting anyone. It's hurting you. It's hurting your relationship with God. Because we don't feel bad because Saul just won a battle. I did what God said not to do, and guess what? Nothing bad happened to me. Because we don't feel the pain. If sin was like touching a hot stove, we'd touch the stove and we'd never sin again. But it's not like that. It's like a frog in boiling water. It's like taking a little bit of poison each day. You don't notice it. You don't feel it. You're like, this isn't bad at all. It's like, why was I so worried about doing this? And then one day you find that this cancer is eating you from the inside out because you've disregarded the thing. Listen, Saul seems like a great idea. And if we knew nothing about the story of Saul, and we stopped here in chapter 11, we're like, man, Israel is set. They got themselves one heck of a king. And Samuel was just an old fuddy-duddy, stuck in his ways, super religious guy. But we know the rest of the story. We know how it ended for Hitler. You know, we can look back and we know the rest of the story of Saul. It doesn't go well. Saul's apparent humility ends up being a lack of confidence in himself, a lack of confidence in God, and he becomes paranoid that everybody's trying to take away what's his. Saul's leadership abilities quickly morph from this great motivator to a dictator. His ability to inspire from his emotion just turns into temper tantrums and a complete lack of self-control to the point where nobody wants to listen to a thing this crazy guy says, because if you don't listen to what he says, he throws a spear at you at dinner time. I mean, this dude is nuts. That kind of seems okay today. Doesn't feel that bad right now. I'm not feeling the consequences. Try to think back to a time when you disregarded God's instructions. How'd that work out? If you're sitting here right now going, fine, then there's just not enough time. And I urge you to repent now before you feel the full weight of those things. When do shortcuts and cheatings ever pan out? How many things in our lives have gone sideways because we forfeited God's blessing and God's protection by rejecting the King's commands? I did my own thing. I went my own way. You know what? It was great for a while. I don't know what the big deal was, but man, did I pay for it in the end. Not God punished me, not God got me under his thumb. When God says don't, he means don't hurt yourself. Don't choose that. That's bad for you. You're not going to like how this works out. You want a king, he's going to take your sons, he's going to take your daughters, he's going to take your land. You're going to be his slaves. We're not his slaves. Give it time. Where have you disregarded God's instructions, warnings, and advice? Because we don't always feel the consequences. The Bible even says the pleasures of sin are for a moment, or the pleasures of sin are for a season. Pleasures are pleasurable. It's kind of nice. I don't know why I was so worried about not doing this, not thinking this, not going there, not participating. It's not that bad. Yet, remember when Barry Bonds played for the Pirates?
Yes.
That was awesome. Like early 90s, like Bonds and Bonilla and Van Slyke. And, I mean, it was just, you had Michael Vallier catching, but hey, you're not going to have an all-star. The whole team isn't all-stars. But that was a great team.
Yes.
And then Barry Bonds left and went to San Francisco and turned into a professional wrestler, right? Like when he left, he was like the size of my wife. And by the time he got to San Francisco, he was twice the size of me. And he's hitting home runs left and right. And he's going to be the greatest baseball player ever. And no, he was cheating.
Joe's.
And now he's Joe. Bernie Madoff was a very wealthy man for a very long time. Largest Ponzi scheme in U.S. history. Millions upon millions. And people look to Bernie and, man, Bernie knows the stock market. And Bernie knows what he's doing. And if I'm going to invest money, I'm going to invest it with Bernie. And the whole time he knew what he was doing was wrong, but he got rich, his kids got rich, and he died in jail. Jeffrey Epstein. Jeffrey Epstein probably thought he had a pretty good thing going on. When he went to jail, it didn't end well for him. Bill Cosby was like America's dad, right? Funny guy, nice guy. I mean, everybody loves Bill Cosby. And he's going to die in jail in Philadelphia. Because he thought he could get away with some stuff on the side that nobody would hear about. And it brings me no joy to mention the name of Ravi Zacharias in that list. Ravi Zacharias was a CMA missionary, well-known, nationally renowned, world-renowned. And he had some stuff going on the side that I hope was breaking his heart. But at the end of the day, that's how he's going to be remembered. What do you think you're getting away with? What does it feel like hasn't caught up to you yet? I'm a Christian, but I mean, these things are that's just ridiculous. I can't do all that. Well, you're right, you can't. God has made no provision for you to live the Christian life, only for him to live it through you. It requires an absolute surrender to Jesus, to let Jesus live these things through you. But oftentimes, it's not that we feel we can't. It's that we don't want to. I don't want to submit. I don't want to surrender. But when we reject the commands of the King, we reject the King. And let me tell you lovingly, sin never ends well for anyone, ever, in the history of the world, ever. Ever. Never. Not one guy's gotten away with it. Not one person lived it out and loved it, and they're happy at the end of the day. It never pans out. 100% failure rate. And yet God is merciful and faithful and forgiving. And God doesn't abandon Israel. In fact, the next king is David. And from the line of David comes Jesus, who's the king who will sit on the throne forever. And even when we choose poorly, there's always this opportunity. God's always saying, repent. God's always saying, come back to me. God's always saying, stop now, no further, turn around, I still love you. God doesn't quit. God doesn't abandon Israel, and he won't abandon you. I know what God says, but I've kind of started down this road, and it doesn't seem that bad. I don't really feel the heat. I'm not feeling the consequences. But God is never wrong. When we reject the commands of the king, we reject the king. I'm not being overly dramatic. It's exactly what God told me. He's saying, don't reject me. Don't reject my blessings. Don't reject my protection. Don't reject my provision, because things are about to go south quickly with Saul. Today's the day, if you hear the voice of the Lord, do not harden your heart. So I'm going to pray, and I'm going to ask that you just kind of spend a minute with God. Lord, is there something that you want to address that needs to go, that needs to stop? It may not feel like it today. Today it may feel like a great idea. Today it may feel like I'm getting away with murder, or it just wasn't that big a deal. Father,